Manufacturer, reproduce goods.
Yeah.
What do you make?
Large fans for laboratories.
Oh, okay. All right, let's get started. Okay, so why don't we start this sif again, because it was like the last 2 minutes of the shir. We're talking about the concept of memory and the role that it plays in being able to provide edus. What happens if something happened like a few years ago and you don't have a clear memory of it? So that's the question in halacha. So the Rav Shulchan Aruch says, "Kol zman shezocher hadavar yachol lahay laolam." That as long as you remember what happened, there's no statute of limitations on the ability to testify. Ve'eno choshe shema mitoch shenit yashen hadavar harbei eno zochro al buryo. And you don't have to worry that perhaps because matter happened so long ago, you don't remember things clearly. He says, and even if your memory is only jogged by looking at something that your notes that you wrote down at the time that it happened, at the time when they told him, you're going to be a witness. So you took notes and you say, like, this is what transpired on such and such a date. And the achshav shachach hadavar ve'eno niska, shasha amru lo ha'edus ve'achshav shachach hadavar ve'eno niskar ela mitoch haksav. And you had forgotten what had happened. But then when you read your notes, you say, oh, that's right, now I remember what happened. So, yachol lahaid, you're allowed to testify. Buhu sha'achar shira aksav nizkar hadavar. But that's only provided that when reading your notes, you say, now I remember. Yes, I was there. Aval im eno nizkar hadavar lo yaid. He says, but you look at your notes and you say, who wrote this? Right? I know it's my handwriting, and I believe you when you say that I was there, but I have no memory of this transaction taking place. So then you should not testify. You should only testify if you genuinely remember based on the notes that you took. Okay. Even though you trust your former self. In other words, I know that it's my handwriting, and I know what I wrote, and I believe my older self or my younger self who wrote this, that I was there. But if you really have no memory, then you're not kosher to testify. You might be able to submit your notes to the Beis Din, but you'd have to tell the Beis Din, I have no memory of this.
One thing I can say in court is to refresh your memory.
Yeah.
So you read it and then you say, "Oh yes, I remember."
You came in the middle. So there's a differentiation in halacha as to what the notes remind you of. If the notes jog your memory and you say, yes, now I remember, then you can testify in Beis Din. But if you read the notes and you say to yourself, I really have no recollection of this at all, even with reading the notes, then you're not allowed to testify. The notes are beneficial if they help jog your memory. Or sometimes you remember that you were there, but you don't remember the details. Because a lot of times there are so many details in a transaction, and there's he said, she said, right? Shenamar al pi shnayim edim v'lo al pi ksavam. And the basis for this halacha, that we know this to be true, is because the Torah says you're only allowed to testify through the alpi. What is the word peh? The mouth. Through the mouth of two witnesses, below alpi ksavam, and not through their handwriting. That's a good question. Let's see. Let's see where we're going with this. V'chein im nizkar hadavar al yedei acher she'izkiro lo, yachol lahayid. And similarly, let's say you don't have notes, but and this happens to me all the time. Your wife reminds you of something that happened, right? What? Does that ever happen? That's right. That's right. I my wife tells me, don't you remember such and such, so and so? We had them over the house, or we went to a certain place and we went to this party or this social event. And I'm at a stage in my life where I just don't remember. It's not even that I have not even that I don't, not only do I not have a fuzzy memory of it, I have no memory of it. And I guess when you lead a very busy life and you interact with a lot of people, I mean, like how many patients do you have? I mean, there's no way to remember every single patient. What do you choose? Yeah. Yeah. That's right. That's right. I think probably physicians probably have this problem, and anyone who sees like lots and lots and lots of people. You're right. You're right. You're right. What's your name again? Okay.
I always I know so many people's names.
Yeah, it's very uncomfortable. I have to say, it's very uncomfortable when I can't get the name out of my head, and I know you. No, I know the names in my memory, and I just can't access it at the moment. It's very, very uncomfortable. So, how are you? It's nice to see you. Anyway. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, so if your friend or your wife or whoever it is jogs your memory and reminds you and then tells you, "Don't you remember?" You say, "Oh yes, now I remember." Then you can also testify. But yes. Oh, well, that was the previous simon. We learned at the end of the simon the laws of Pruzbal. We just went through it very quickly because it was before Rosh Hashanah, but you would have to have a Pruzbal in order for there to be a financial debt remaining in many instances, right? Not always. The Rav Shulchan Aruch had brought poskim who said that Shemitah today is only derabanan, and since Shemitah today is only derabanan, it doesn't cancel debts. Correct, and that's certainly wrong, and certainly a person who is a creditor can write a prosbol at the end of Shemitah and avoid the cancellation according to all the opinions, and that's what people did, right? So anyway, so you could have a debt, a transaction. You could have maybe what would be very common is when a couple's getting divorced, and you were a witness to an agreement, a prenuptial agreement that happened many, many years ago. And you were witness to the fact that the husband promised the wife that if we ever split up, I promise that I'll do X, Y, and Z, right? So Beis Din may take that into consideration if you have the testimony. That's a long-term edus, right? Okay, now, va'afilu im habaldin ba'atzmu mazkiro v'nizkar yachol lahayid, imhu talmid chacham, right? Now, even if the litigant himself, who has asked you to testify on his behalf, has to jog your memory, then that's also okay. So I want you to come to Beis Din and tell the Beis Din that we entered into this transaction. The guy says, I don't remember. He says, don't you remember? Oh, yeah. But in that situation, the Rav Shulchan Aruch says that you as a witness have to be a Talmud Chacham. Because we can assume that a Talmud Chacham would only testify if he indeed remembered it himself. So you have to, if you are ever in this situation and the litigant himself asks you to testify on his behalf, you have to really make sure that you really remember it. And it's not just that you're going along with what his version of what happened. So that's why you have to be a Talmud Chacham. You have to know for yourself that you really remember it. Okay.
And must have advice to make sure that the person who took the bond hasn't actually paid it back, and the person's trying to cover the claim.
Well, that's not your responsibility as the witness. The guy says, "Do me a favor and testify on my behalf that the loan took place." It may have been paid back, but he's building his case before the Beis Din. If the defendant indeed claims, "I don't contest the loan, but I paid you back," then your testimony is not relevant, right? Right. That's right. That's right. Okay, so now let's take a look at the Imrei Yaakov. Chaf Dalid, Shezocher Hadavar. As long as you remember it, the testimony is valid. There's no statute of limitations. Lo mibaya imnasa mitchila eid badavar da'az mitchila ramya anafshe ve'eno shochcha. He says it makes no difference whether you were initially called in to act as a witness. In other words, you were designated as a witness, because then we assume that you really, since you were called upon to witness a transaction, you are more careful to try and remember it. Even if you were just happened to be there and you were not designated as a witness, as long as you still remember it clearly, you're kosher to testify. It could be years later, but you're still kosher to testify. V'lo al pi ksavam, the Torah says that you can only testify through your mouth, through your memory, and not through your writing. Isa b'shulchan aruch, ha'edim sheshalchu edusam b'chsav lebeis din eno edus. The Shulchan Aruch says that if a witness does not appear live before a beis din, but instead sends written testimony to beis din, that's not called admissible testimony. Dichsiv al pi shnayim edim mipihem below mipi ksavam. And then using the same principle, you can't testify with your writing, you can only testify with your mouth. And then the Rama writes, now this is very interesting. What about all of the new technologies? We'll talk about it. So the Rama adds over there, he says, V'chein nohagin udelo kiyesh machshirim im ha'edim ru'uyin laha'id ve'enam ilmim ad kan l'shana. And the Rama corroborates the psak of the Mechaber, of the Beis Yosef, and he says that there is an opinion which disagrees and says that testimony can be submitted in writing as long as the witnesses are not mute, right? Because if they're mute, then they're no longer kosher as witnesses, so even their writing would not be submissible. But the Rama writes that there are two opinions on this matter. We paskin that even if they're perfectly intact in their ability to testify, we still do not allow them to testify in writing. Aval hasma kasav the hatosvus v'harosh v'hamordechai v'hator kasav b'shem Rabbeinu Tam the mutter lishloch edusa b'chsav. That the Sma brings a whole series of Rishonim who paskin, most of them the Bali Atosvus, they paskin that a person can submit their testimony in writing. Kol shezocher ha'edus v'yachol laha'ed b'fiv. So long as when you submit your written testimony, you do remember. In other words, you can't submit la'afuke ilaim de'en roi l'kayim bo al pi shnayim edim. So this is to the exclusion of a mute. If a person is physically disabled that they're not able to speak, then we don't accept their testimony in writing, even according to this more lenient opinion, since they're simply not kosher to be able to testify. You have to at least be able to testify in order, according to this opinion, to submit your testimony in writing. We're going to get to it in just a minute. Well, yeah. Well, we already learned the reason why. Al pihem v'lo al pi ksava. It could be, or it just could be exeris akasa. We don't know. We don't know the for sure the reason, but it could very well be like you're saying, Paul. There's no room for cross-examination. Umishum dechol haroi labila in bila ma'akvasa. And there's a principle which I think we might have learned before. Kol haroi labila ein bila ma'akeves. That's an important term that you may want to just try to store in your long-term memory banks. Kol haroi labila, and we're talking about memory. that hard drive is shot. Yeah. Kol haroi labila ein bila ma'akeves means as follows. There is a requirement that when you bring a flower offering, you're supposed to mix, in certain flower offerings, you're supposed to mix the oil with the flour. And so the Gemara says that there is a certain quantity of flour versus oil, that if it's such a large quantity, then it's not going to mix well. So the Gemara says as follows, Lechatchila, you have to mix the flour and oil. But b'di'evid, if you didn't mix the flour and oil, it's still kosher. Because bila is mixing, eina me'akevet. It does not stop the korban from being kosher. It's still kosher b'di'evid. Even though lechatchili you're supposed to do it, but b'di'evid it's still kosher. What happens if the container is so large, then even if you tried to mix it, it would not mix well. So the Gemara says, then even if you, then in that situation, even b'di'evid, it's not kosher, because you have to have the capacity for a proper mixture in order for an unmixed offering to be kosher. It has to be able to be mixed. But if it's not capable of being mixed, so then even b'di'evid, it's not kosher at all. That's the principle, that you have to be capable of reaching a certain state, such that even if you don't reach that state, b'di'evid, you're still kosher. Using that idea, we apply that to many other principles in halacha, and one of them is over here. Lechatchila, you're supposed to testify in person. According to this more lenient opinion, b'di'evid, if you don't show up, but you only send your written testimony, your testimony is kosher. But you have to at least be capable of testifying live in order for your written testimony to be kosher. If you're not capable of testifying live because you have no capacity to speak, so then even your written testimony is not kosher. That's the principle of kol haroi labila ein bila ma'akeves. Umashma dahachi sfirale, and it sounds like from the Smaz commentary that that's how he's paskening. He's paskening contrary to the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah, and he's saying that using all of these Balei HaTosfos, a witness can submit their testimony in writing. Okay.
And then pass away. Someone is able to verify that that's
Yes. Now, right. And now there's a big difference between testimony and signatures on a document. Signature on a document is a form of testimony, but it has greater power because we always admit a signature, a signed document, right? Sometimes we may need what's called kiyum hashtar. We may need a substantiation of the signature to verify that that's that person's signature. But that signature, once people have recognized that signature and can say, yes, that's that person's signature, then that's a legally binding document. But here we're talking about someone being called upon to testify about what happened, right? Okay. Now, yes. Now, v'ra'isi mimorei hara'a shelo ratzu litroach hatalmid chacham. So Rav Stern now writes, it is my personal experience that I've seen greater Gedolei HaPoskim permit a Talmid Chacham who's been called to testify not to be matriach him, not to burden him by having to show up live to the Beis Din. And they will allow a person who's an honored person in the community to submit his testimony in writing instead. Or me'achar ula rabbeinu tam v'siyato afilu below talmud chacham mutar lasos kein ad kam l'sham. I'm sorry, this is not Reb Stern speaking. This is the Sma. He says, I have seen this, I have witnessed this, and it would seem to me that you don't even have to be a talmud chacham, but it's even permissible to submit your testimony in writing. If you're not a talmud chacham, it's just that it's inconvenient for you to show up live at the Beis Din. So this is all a quote from the Sma. The Kosav al Zeh Hatumim, Dahani Mili Bedavar Shein Sarach Lekabel Edus Bifnei Baal Din. He says, and now on that, Rabbi Yonasan Eibschitz writes that that's only true where it's a type of testimony that does not have to be made in the presence of the litigants. Aval Bedavar Shetzarach Edus Bifnei Baal Din, Gam LeRabbeinu Tam Lo Mahani Edus B'Ksav Yado. But he says, and this is all detailed in the Shulchan Aruch. Under what circumstances must testimony be done in the presence of the litigants, and when may it be done in their absence? The Shulchan Aruch delineates different situations, but if the testimony must be heard in the presence of the litigants, so then you wouldn't be allowed to submit your testimony in writing. He says, "The dochak lomer to hold v'koren aksav b'fnei bal davar ha'avalei kameid b'fanav." He says, because you can't say just because they're reading the written testimony in the presence of a litigant, then that acts as a proper substitution. The harei eno doma re'iyas panim de eno meyes. He says that there are certain situations where if the litigant says, I don't trust that witness, I think he's lying, then he has a right to demand that the witness testify in his presence, because the whole idea is to make that witness squirm in the presence of the person that he is accused of lying against. Masha'ena kain biksiva da'az meyes. He says, when it comes to written testimony, a person may have more chutzpah and write a falsehood. And therefore, if you're testifying against someone who you're being called upon in the Beis Din to testify that so-and-so committed an isser, such as, let's say, he committed adultery, or he committed some other kind of crime. I saw him eating treif, and therefore you should not accept him as an acceptable so-and-so within the community, right? That has to be done in the person's presence, according to Rabbi Yonasan Eibschitz, because the guy is denying the accusation, and we're not going to allow people to submit written testimony, and there's a lot of logic to that. The imha'edim meviim ksavim lebeis din, va'omrim ma shekasav kan eno mi'idim mahani l'kuli alma. Now, if anu me'idim says, let's say witnesses come to court and they submit an affidavit in writing that this is my testimony, and this is my everything that I have written here in this affidavit is what I remember seeing, then that testimony is admissible, because since they're showing up and they're submitting an affidavit, it means that they're not trying to squirm or to wiggle out of it. V'chol hanal ma'iri b'ksivas edus she'eno shtar. Aval be'edus she'bishtar, he says now, and this goes to Doug's issue. He says up until now we've been talking about testimony that is not in a written contract, but testimony with a witness's signature in a contract. The Rambam writes, the Choshen dinei mominus be'edus she'bishtar afal pi she'ena idim kayamin. This is exactly the point that you made, Doug. We always accept a witness's signature or his statement in a contract, right? If he says, I hereby testify that I have signed, witnessed, and this transaction on such and such a date, signed so-and-so, we always accept that, even if the witnesses are not present. And the reason is because if we didn't allow that, people wouldn't lend money. People wouldn't lend money. But you mean if you want me to lend you money, but the halacha is that if I can't produce witnesses to the transaction live, I can't get my money back. People are not going to lend money. So that's why the rabbi said that even though normally you can always demand two live witnesses if there's any contest, if anyone's disputing the claim, but that's not true when it comes to financial affairs where witnesses signed a contract. Yeah, exactly. Because of us, yeah, because it's a signature on a legally binding shtar. Because of asma the davka shu shtar gomer hitiru mishum tikkun ha'olam kidei shelo tinol dela shelo yilvu mishum yiravi upachad shelo yamuso heidem o yelchel medina sayam. So the sma on that point writes that the only time that we allow a witness's signature, even without the witness coming to court, is when it's a legal shtar, it's a legal contract. And that is because we don't want people to refrain from lending money out of a fear that they won't be able to get the witnesses because they left town or they passed away, etc. And it sounds like from what our sages are telling us that really by rights, the Torah should not allow a signature to act in the stead of a live witness. But the rabbis insisted upon it because they saw that people were not going to be lending money. The Shach, however, disagrees with the Sma, and he says written signatures on a legally binding contract are biblically binding and give the power of collection even midioraisa. The Amrinan Demin HaTorah Ein Sarach Hashtar Kiyum, the Eidu Shabishtar Kamishanech Eidus Bebestin. The Shach writes that as long as we know that this is their signature, the defendant has no rights of demanding cross-examination and so forth and so on. Uchvar Hisig al Harambam, Haramban, the Sefer HaMitzvahs, Sof, Shorish Hasheni, because of the Hisigol of Chachmei Hadoros Chuvos Gemuros Verayos Beruros. And the Ramban disagrees with this Rambam that's quoted by the Shach and says, no, it does not work biblically, it only works rabbinically. Because of Sham HaRamban, Demasha Amr Mipihem Velo Mipik Savam, Ze'eno Bishtar, Shabal Davar Kasvo, Kagon Gittin Vikidushin Vahalvos Mechiros Ad Kam Lashana. So hold on a second. I'm sorry. So it sounds like from the Rambam that it only works rabbinically. The Shach quotes from the Ramban that it definitely works not only rabbinically, but even biblically. And he says, and what about the fact that the Gemara says that only verbal testimony is admissible and not written testimony? That does not apply to shtaros, that does not apply to contracts, right? Kagon gittin, v'kiddushin, v'halvos, u'mechiros ad kam l'shana, such as divorce papers, kiddushin papers, loan papers, sale papers, etc. So that's what we have so far. We have a machlokus between the Rambam and the Ramban as to whether signed contracts are collectible midioraisa or only midirabbanan. Now, the Hataz kasav levar shitas Rambam v'zelashana. Taz just finishes off to try and explain the rationale of the Rambam, who says that it only works rabbinically and not biblically. He writes, "V'nira lefianios daiti ladas Rambam delichora kram mefurish biyirmiya neged divrei Rambam." He says, first of all, it seems like there's an express pasuk in Sefer Yirmiyah that seems to contradict the Rambam. Because it says that God told the prophet, write this down in a scroll and sign on it. And it seems like that the context over there was that it was a sale document, which God himself declares to the prophet was legally binding. So what are you going to do with that pasuk from Yirmiyah, which contradicts the other drasha from the Gemara based on another pasuk that the testimony must be verbal and not written? It says, "Sarach lomar heicha degoli kra demahani shtar goli below b'makom acher." You have to conclude that only when the Torah reveals to you that signatures are effective, that's where the testimony does not have to be verbal; it can be even written. So therefore, when any transactional contracts, any divorce papers, so he says, so the Taz says, basically, anywhere where the Torah reveals to us that the contract works with written signatures, that's what we can rely on, that it works even midioraisa. But if there's something ambiguous that we're not sure whether it's a real contractual document, a transactional document, but it's really written more loosey-goosey, and someone just writes in their handwriting that I saw what went on, that's not something that we can say works legally. Okay. Okay, we'll have to hold it here for today. Have a wonderful day, everybody. He arrived last night. He told me he's going to text you. Do you want to stop into the thing to this evening just to check it out? Yeah, it starts at 7. It'll be in the Gruta. I told him to text you because you had asked that. I told him to text you. So he's going to send you a WhatsApp.
We always say, lawyer can't argue with the time, right? All of a sudden, all hell breaks loose because he hit the Rishon, and anyone can argue with anybody, and you got Spud, Rambam arguing with, like, everything is later. So, like, why does it stop? Where's the respect? Or there is no
right. No, it's a very good question. There were barriers that were set up from the times of the Mishnah to the times of the Gemara.
And then it's down
after that? And then you can't argue with an Amora once the Shas was completed. If the consensus of the Gemara is this is how we interpret a Mishnah, you can't as a Rishon go against an Amora. But after Stimas Shas, after Shas was finished, then it's fair game for someone in the 11th century to argue with someone in the 9th century or someone in the 15th century to argue with
someone in the 10th century.
Right, yeah.
Which is sort of, is that a no? That's obviously because we have it all.
Yeah. Although it is unusual for an Acharon to argue with a Rishon if there's no disagreement, but it does happen occasionally. There are times even when an Acharon will argue with a Rishon.
Forwarding it, I'm just going to show it to you. This was the email that Miriam Klein sent to Jack. Here's his response.
Too much.
Brech or what?
It's just too much. He's over the top. No, forget it.
No.
So what was the final response to him? Was there ever a written response to him?
They sent it last night. I'm not